Most people picture the biggest medieval battles as giant, perfectly staged showdowns with armies so huge you can't even count them. The problem is that a lot of those famous numbers come from storytelling, politics, and rough guesswork, not real head counts. Medieval commanders also had to deal with hard limits like food, horses, roads, and how long an army could even stay in one area. So when someone says 100,000 warriors, it's worth asking, could that many people actually march, camp, and fight together? Let's break down the biggest medieval battle myth that almost everyone still believes. Number 1. The crowdsize myth. People often picture a major medieval battle as a vast sea of fighters with impossibly big armies facing off in one neat place, as if they could be arranged into two perfect blocks. You see numbers in pop history and games that sound certain. 80,000 here, 120,000 there, sometimes even hundreds of thousands. The myth isn't just that medieval battles were large. It's that they were routinely enormous, and that medieval writers were basically reporting head counts. In reality, the biggest battles of the Middle Ages could be huge by medieval standards and still be much smaller than what people imagine. That mismatch happens because medieval warfare had a different center of gravity. Most fighting time went into marching, raiding, guarding roads, taking castles, and especially sieges. A set-piece field battle was high risk, hard to control, and not something commanders casually chased unless they thought the odds were good or their situation was desperate. So when sources describe a battle as countless, like sand, or attach a giant round number to it, that usually tells you more about the story they want to tell than the literal size of the army. Once you start treating medieval numbers as claims that need checking, a lot of famous mega battles shrink into something more realistic, and the whole way medieval armies worked starts to click. Number 2. Why medieval numbers inflate. Medieval authors weren't writing with modern statistical habits, and many weren't even near the battlefield. Some were clerics writing moral history, some were connected to a court that wanted a flattering version, and some were compiling earlier texts decades later. That doesn't mean they lied on purpose every time. It means their job was often meaning and reputation, not precise accounting. Big enemy numbers make a victory look heroic, and big friendly numbers make a defeat feel less embarrassing. Either way, inflation is useful. There's also a cultural layer. Medieval writing loves set numbers and familiar patterns. Figures like 10,000 or 40,000 can function like a lot, and numbers tied to scripture or classical tradition can show up because they feel authoritative, not because someone counted. Even when a writer tries to be careful, medieval counting terms can be slippery. One source might count men at arms, another might count lances. A lance can mean a fighting man plus a small team around him, squire, groom, sometimes additional mounted support. So the same force can look larger depending on what's being counted. Then there's the baggage crowd. Armies dragged along servants, drivers, traders, camp followers, and local guides. Those people mattered to how an army moved and survived, but they weren't all combat troops. If a writer saw a long column on the road or heard how big the camp looked, it's easy to report the whole moving world as the army. Copying also creates accidental growth. Medieval manuscripts were hand-copied. A single misread numeral, a smudged mark, or a dropped word can turn a plausible figure into a monster. And sometimes, numbers are doubled without anyone noticing. A writer counts allied contingents, then later adds the total again as if it were additional troops. Round numbers are another giveaway. 10,000, 20,000, 60,000 often behave like labels rather than measured totals. But when a chronicle says an army had 100,000 men, it's not a stopwatch reading. It's closer to a headline. That's why modern historians usually treat medieval battle numbers as ranges, and they rebuild those ranges using constraints the sources couldn't ignore. Number 3. The hard ceiling is logistics. The fastest way to test an army size claim is to ask a boring question. How did they feed everyone? And how did they feed the horses? Medieval armies didn't just march, they ate the countryside around them. Men need daily calories, but horses are the real limit because fodder is bulky. A war horse can need well over 10 kilograms of forage a day, plus grain when available. And an army had not just cavalry mounts, but pack animals pulling wagons. Every extra 1,000 horses is a moving demand for fields, barns, mills, and water sources. That creates a practical problem. Even if a ruler could gather a gigantic host, keeping it together for long is another matter. Food has to be collected, moved, and protected. Foraging parties have to spread out, which makes them vulnerable. If the army stays too long, it empties the area and has to march on, which can ruin a siege plan or break coordination with allies. Now, add the pace of medieval transport. Roads were rough, bridges were choke points, and wagons broke. You can't just ship in supplies at scale unless you control rivers, ports, and storage, and even then, it's seasonal. That's why medieval campaigns often stick to certain corridors, river valleys, established roads, areas with towns, or coastal routes with ships shadowing the army. It also explains why armies split into multiple columns. Putting everyone in one tight mass sounds powerful, but it can starve itself. Separate forces can forage in different directions, then converge for a siege or a planned battle. Weather matters too. Campaign seasons usually cluster in late spring through early autumn because winter roads and empty fields are brutal. Late medieval states get better at administration, contracts, pay chests, organized supply purchases, and that can support larger forces for longer, but the limits don't disappear. So, when a source claims a gigantic medieval host camped in one place for weeks, alarm bells should ring. Large medieval armies did exist, especially when multiple allies came together, or when a state with stronger administration could hire and supply troops. But they are the exception, and even then, they're shaped by the limits of food, fodder, and transport. Number 4. What big looked like on the ground. Medieval armies weren't just knights in armor. They were mixed groups with different roles, and that mix changes over time and region. Knights and other men-at-arms were the expensive core, trained, equipped, often mounted, but they were rarely the majority. In many armies, the fully armored elite could be a few hundred to a few thousand, while the rest were infantry and missile troops. Infantry could include spearmen, billmen, axemen, professional foot soldiers hired for a campaign, and militia from towns who trained because their city's survival depended on it. Missile troops mattered constantly. Archers and crossbowmen could disrupt formations, protect flanks, and force the enemy to attack. English armies in the 100 Years' War are famous for fielding large numbers of archers compared to men-at-arms. Engineers, miners, carpenters, and artillery crews become increasingly important in the later Middle Ages because sieges dominate strategy. Recruitment methods also shape scale. Early medieval rulers might call up obligations from nobles and local levies, which can bring numbers quickly, but can be hard to keep in the field. Later, contracts and wages become more common, creating smaller but more reliable forces that can campaign longer. Mercenaries, sometimes local, sometimes foreign, fill gaps when a ruler needs experienced fighters, but they still need pay and supplies, which again pushes back against fantasy numbers. Behind the fighters, you have the support world: grooms, smiths, drivers, cooks, clerks, and medical attendants. When people imagine an army of 30,000, they often picture 30,000 fighters. Medieval reality might be 12,000 to 20,000 fighters, plus a large support tail, depending on the army and the campaign, and that tail can make an army look enormous without doubling its fighting strength. Some famous examples show the pattern. For Hastings, 1066, you'll see big claims in later storytelling, but many modern discussions put the forces in the high thousands rather than in the tens of thousands. For Agincourt, 1415, a common modern range is roughly 6,000 to 9,000 English against perhaps 12,000 to 25,000 French, with older narratives often inflating the French side far higher. For Bouvines, 1214, estimates also tend to land in the thousands to low tens of thousands on each side, not in six figures. In England's Wars of the Roses, Towton, 1461, is often treated as one of the largest field battles on English soil, and modern estimates can still put the combined forces around the tens of thousands, sometimes around 50,000 or more, which is enormous by medieval standards, but not the fantasy numbers people expect. In Central and Eastern Europe, Grunwald/Tannenberg, 1410, is another big one. And again, modern ranges are usually in the tens of thousands total, not in the hundreds of thousands. These ranges move because evidence is uneven, but the key point is consistent. Medieval big usually means thousands to tens of thousands, with only a handful of battles plausibly reaching very high totals. And once you picture, say, 15,000 to 30,000 fighters spread across a landscape with baggage, animals, and uneven terrain, the battlefield starts to look less like a packed arena and more like a long, messy zone of movement.
Number 5. Why the myth feels true anyway. If medieval armies were often smaller than the legendary numbers, why does the endless crowd image stick so hard? One reason is that battles were visually intense even at smaller scales. A few thousand armored men, hundreds of banners, thousands of horses, and long lines of archers can fill the horizon for someone standing at ground level. Another reason is that medieval writers and later storytellers focused on the moments that feel decisive, the clash of elites, the turning point, the rout. That focus can make the event sound like the whole war, when the war was mostly other things. Once you zoom in on how battles actually worked, the Hollywood version starts to drift. Commanders tried to keep some order. Armies were often divided into battles or divisions, vanguard, main body, rear, each tied to a leader and a cluster of retinues. Standards and banners weren't just decoration. They were practical reference points for keeping people oriented. Messages moved by riders and signals, and plans were often simple because control was limited. Troops didn't just run at each other in a single chaotic ball. Formations mattered, terrain mattered, fatigue mattered, and morale often mattered more than raw killing. Many fights feature long periods of probing, missile exchanges, and slow pushing contests where units try to hold ground and avoid collapsing. Most battles end not because every man is cut down, but because one side decides it's over, by retreating, breaking formation, or losing cohesion. Casualties could be heavy, but capture and ransom were also a major feature among the wealthy, which changes the incentives for knights and men-at-arms. Even the famous knight charge is often misunderstood. Mounted men-at-arms were powerful, but they needed space, ground that allowed speed,
and a target that could be shaken.
Against prepared infantry with good positioning, stakes, ditches, rough ground or dense spear formations, cavalry could fail badly. That's why battles are full of dismounted men-at-arms fighting on foot, and why archers, crossbowmen, and disciplined infantry keep showing up as battle shapers. And there's one more detail that matters for the crowdsize myth. The worst losses often happen in a rout, when one side breaks and gets chased, not during the initial collision. So a battle can feel like a total disaster in the sources, even if it involved fewer people than the legendary numbers claim. Number 6. How the real numbers get rebuilt. When historians try to estimate medieval army sizes, they rarely trust a single narrative source on its own. They cross-check documents that were created for practical reasons: pay records, muster rolls, contracts for service, ship lists, tax accounts, and letters that mention how many units showed up. Sometimes the evidence is indirect, but still useful. If a king hired a certain number of men-at-arms and archers by contract, the paperwork can suggest a minimum, and repeated payments over weeks can show whether the force stayed intact or melted away. If a campaign required a fleet, the number of ships and their typical capacity can put a ceiling on how many soldiers could have arrived at once. Geography matters too. If an army marched along a known route, the width of roads, bridge crossings, and the number of nearby settlements can limit how many people could move and camp without turning into gridlock. Battlefield terrain can also reject the fantasy numbers. If the usable ground between woods, rivers, and marshes only allows a certain frontage, the idea of 100,000 men fighting shoulder to shoulder stops being plausible. Archaeology can add another layer. Mass burials, weapon finds, and battlefield landscapes can support or challenge a claimed scale, even if they can't produce an exact headcount. Comparisons help too.
If a realm's total population and tax base are known, it becomes harder to believe claims that it fielded an army equal to a large chunk of its adult male population. At the same time, it was also farming, guarding towns, and keeping order. The most reliable reconstructions usually end up with a range, not a single number, because medieval evidence is fragmentary, and because words like host, army, and following can include different mixes of fighters and non-fighters in different texts. That's why one battle can have several respectable modern estimates, each based on a different mix of documents, terrain logic, and source criticism, and why the headline numbers from the chronicles often end up being the least solid detail in the whole account.